the vision was started in like 69, 70, 71, but it continues today because of so many people like you that are invested in serving the people who are in need in this area. So I congratulate all of you for coming to Unity House, and I hope that you stay for a good long time. Anyway, we're going to start with a history lesson. How many were history majors in college or high school or wherever? Oh, well, one, oh, two. Okay. I was actually too, but sort of by mistake. I just got assigned to history whether I wanted it or not, but I did like it. At the end, we will have a test, but there will not be any failures, but your next raise may depend on how well you do in this contest.
Mary Jane was a teacher in her prior life.
In case you didn't guess, for 22 years. So. I hope that you can catch the spirit of the early Unity House days. Let's start talking about taking a glance at what life was like in the nation in the late 60s, early 70s. I know Frank Prezio and Chris and I were here. How many others were here or were aware of what was going on then at that time? Not too many. Most of you probably weren't even born then. But I was born in 1928, so that qualifies me to have been somewhat of a grown-up anyway. In the nation, we were getting into a very unsettled time. We'd come through World War II, and then the 50s were sort of a euphoric time when people could calm down and live and appreciate the American way of life and all of that. But then came the 60s and boom, everything was in uproar. And from my vision, that was all a good thing. I think we were just too complacent and we needed to be stunned alive. We know that, for example, we had the Vietnam War there, and not everybody thought that was a wonderful thing. And there were many protests and all kinds of uprising. I remember being part of a group down there in Congress and First Street, where we were picketing Russell Sage. I can't imagine why we were picketing Russell Sage, but we were. Maybe it was just the place to protest, but that went on all over. Then we had the election of John Kennedy. That was a nice turning point. That was earlier in that decade. But then very shortly after that, there was his assassination, and then came the assassination of Martin Luther King, followed by that of Bobby Kennedy. So, there really was tumult, and there should have been. Those were outrageous things to have ever happened. So it wasn't a calm, peaceful time, but I think that it enlivened us to wake up and see what the injustices were. Racial tensions were very high. People of color were denied voting rights, housing rights, all kinds of things, education. I'm sure in your history books you learned about that as the days went on. So it wasn't a calm, peaceful time at all. And then we come to the city of Troy. And Troy had its problems, as it still does, but at that time there was a real blight of poverty, worse than it is. We got plenty of unfair situations now, but it was even worse then. There were many rundown, poor neighborhoods, and who lived in those neighborhoods, but poor people. And little attention was paid to them at the time. Then in the Troy, we started our work unplanned to grow out of 309 8th Street. I think probably all of you have seen that building at one time or another. That was the hub for everything. Everything started there. There wasn't one program that didn't start in that building. That building is very dear to my heart today. But 8th Street then had many torn down buildings, many dilapidated buildings, and the landowners were told not to make repairs on their buildings because they were going to be torn down. And what most people don't know is that as we have 787 on the western side of the Hudson River. There was to be a comparable highway on this side of the river, beginning down by the Menands Bridge and coming all the way up to Hoosick Street, and then hooking on to what is now the Hoosick Street Bridge. So a lot of homes, a lot of people were displaced. In South Troy, a whole neighborhood was wiped out. And then along 8th Street, you know how there's a whole area with no housing? That was all filled with people's housing. They were torn down, and then we only got the building we got because the owner had been told, don't make any repairs, it's going to be torn down. So it was a sad time for many people, especially for poor people. Hoosick Street at that time was either a 2-lane or a 3-lane highway, and there were houses on both sides where the bridge is now, coming right up from River Street. There were houses and there were businesses all along there, and that all got wiped out in preparation for the bridge later on. People displaced. It's always the poor that get displaced. You know, they don't ever go into the affluent neighborhoods and displace people, do they? You can't see any of that because they'd raise so much hell that it wouldn't be worth the politicians' trouble to even try. So that was the way that Troy looked, or the area where we started looked around the time that we got started. And now I'm going to go off to the Catholic Church. And I will be doing that because I was born into a Catholic family, and I entered the convent in 1946 when I was 18 years old, as most women did in those days. And I didn't mean to get into that, because first I wanted to concentrate on the church. And those of you who may have been Catholic or are Catholic may have heard of the Vatican II Council that was held in the mid-60s. And that was a wake-up call for Catholicism. The Pope at the time was John the 23rd, and he said it's time for us to open the windows and let the fresh air in. And that did happen. All the bishops from the whole world were over in Rome. All men, no women, were allowed to have a voice. There were, I think, something like 5 women allowed to attend and watch what was going on. But anyway, some good things happened even though women didn't have much of a voice, and they still don't today, in case you don't know that. But that Vatican Council came up with a lot of very good documents. One of them was the Church in the Modern World, and that said, wake up, folks, you know, this is a new era, new things are happening, and the idea that the Catholics were members of the one true church needs to go. You know, there are all kinds of religions and there are all kinds of good people in them, and we have to learn to respect others. That effort is still going on. It isn't complete, but things are a whole lot better. It also addressed the liturgy that we had in our churches. If you were, well, no, you wouldn't, none of you here, except the older ones, would have gone to Catholic churches where the altar was up here and the priest's back was to the congregation and the liturgy was conducted in Latin. They said, okay, let's change all that around. Let's turn the altar, a table where the priest would preside over the Eucharistic service, facing the congregation, and it would be in English. For Catholics, that was a big step forward. Another big thing that happened, which was very beneficial to me and a lot of my friends, was that religious orders were addressed. And they were told, you know, go back and look at and see why your order was founded, and look at the way you're living, and do something about it. The world has many, many needs, and maybe we need to look at them. At that time, the majority of women's religious orders were composed of people who became teachers. A few worked in orphanages or in nursing, but the majority were teachers. And that's because when nuns first came, most of them came from Europe in mid-19th century, There was a need because Catholics were discriminated against. The Italian kids, the Polish kids, the Irish kids were really looked down and had a hard time in the public schools, so they started schools. But that time has come and gone. When I entered, just about 90% of the women were teachers, and I was a teacher in parochial schools for 22 years. But that changed with the challenge to go and look at what your roots were and what is the need today. You know, if you got public schools and are working or aren't working, go in and straighten them out. And that still needs attention today, I'm sure we all agree. The same with healthcare and things of that nature. So in our community, which was the Sisters of St. Joseph, our provincial house, was the computer center at RPI. Have you ever been there? The chapel there is a beautiful building and is now the computer center, where the library is across that. They form a T. The library is here in the chapel behind it. They tore down where we lived. They needed to. That was pretty old, and dormitory living with a group of 32 people wasn't ideal. So they sold the land to RPI and moved up to Latham. And throughout the country, our order and other orders began having meetings. Well, what does all this mean to us? What should we do to address the modern world? And one of the first things they decided was, well, we don't need to wear habits. For those of you who don't know, most nuns then, a few still do, wore habits. Usually it was long black dresses, you know, with maybe rosaries on the side and veils and white stuff around your face, you know. And, you know, the more I look at, well, when they first began to talk about change, oh my God, this is about time to do this. It was so hot and uncomfortable in the summertime with that starchy stuff around your face, and I perspired terribly and it would be soaking wet by night. So anyway, it was when the opportunity came that we could take off the habit and wear ordinary street clothes as long as they were black, blue, brown, or gray. And your elbows were covered and your knees were covered. One time I got chastised by my provincial because she called me out of chapel to tell me that my elbows weren't covered. So I could not wear that again, so I put a piece around the edge. That really was jazzy. My late husband always told me that the reason he was attracted to me was because of my elbows. So see, she wasn't far off. Anyway, I digress, and I don't mean to. The other thing we could do, we all had religious names. You became Sister so-and-so. And if you wanted to go back to your own name, the name you wore from the time of your birth, you could do that. And I was the same with the habit. You didn't have to change, but you could change. So in 1967, I think it was, we were able to change if we wanted. I lived at the provincial house at the time with 400 others. The day we could change was Christmas Eve that year, and there were 5 of us who changed. So I felt like Lady Godiva walking into the chapel that day, even though I had a black suit and a black veil and all the rest. Anyway, but those, and then the names, you could go back to your own name. I was Sister Samuel Joseph, better known to my students as Sammy Joe. They always they didn't call me that, but somebody would always come and tell me, Sister, the other kids call you Sammy Joe, but I don't. Oh, I know. I can't believe anyone would do that. But anyway, so those were dramatic changes. And then the next group meeting, you can go out and look at what you're doing, you know, if you're teaching or nursing or whatever, and you can think about whether you ought to continue doing that or doing something else. So I had the very good experience that the summer of 1968 to be assigned to work in the CYO in South Troy. At that time, Father Jay Rooney, who still lives, was a pioneer in alerting people to look at what was going on around them. And we had two groups of people, one that would work out of South Troy Center, and mainly it was the kids from Taylor Apartments and Ahern Apartments, which are now torn down, up the street. And then there was another center at St. Peter's up on Fifth Avenue, you know, it's really kind of in the heart of things. And there was a program there. Working in the programs were 8 nuns. Four of us were from the Sisters of St. Joseph, and 4 was from the Sisters of Mercy, and we all lived together. And that was history in the making, because every religious order was separate, you know, and you spoke to each other, but you didn't work, sort of rivalry, if you will. So, but that was a very pleasant experience for all of us. And we were joined by 4 Franciscan friars from the St. Anthony on Hudson over in Rensselaer. These were young men studying for the priesthood. So we went to our first meeting the week before the kids came, and Jay Rooney said, gave everybody their assignments, and he said to Peter Callahan, one of the friars, and me, you two will be the social workers. Duh, you know, what did we know about social work? So, well, our job was to go around to the houses of all the families of the kids that were in the program and see what was going on. Well, for all of us that summer was a mind-blowing opportunity, and for Peter and me, it significantly changed our whole outlook on life. We couldn't believe it. We both came from middle-class families, not wealthy, but we had no experience with poverty. You know, we knew there was poverty, but it hadn't hit us. And I was 40 years old then, too. It should have hit me a little bit before that, but it hadn't. And we were saddened by all the things we saw. So we tried to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I think we did get some good, but the greatest good was for ourselves, that our minds were opened up to looking at the world in a very different way. So that was the summer of 1968, and the habits had changed, the names had changed, and then an edict came out that if we wanted to and could justify our moving for a good reason, we could move out of convents. Now, convents may be a word not familiar to you. It's a place where sisters lived, and every Catholic parish that had sisters working in it had a convent or a provincial house. And we were told that we could move out into apartments if we could justify it. And that was, wow, you know, maybe this is something we should do. That summer, I had went down to pick up some sisters who had been on retreat in New York, and another sister and I went, and Peter, one of the friars, and Joe, another one, came with us. And we stayed overnight in a place where some Franciscan priests, black Franciscans, were living on, I think it was East 7th Street in Manhattan. And they were living in an apartment in a real poor area where you know, it was about as bad as it could be. And they were working with the people. So that kind of, wow, you know, maybe if they can do it, maybe we can do something like this. So I got some of my friends together, and we wrote a proposal to our order that we would be allowed to get an apartment in the poverty area of Troy. Five of the group, there were 10 that signed the proposal, and we would begin a mission, which came to be Unity House, as it turned out. And our plan was that 3 of the sisters would go out and get regular jobs in like a public school where they get paid. We were paid $2,500 a year whether we needed it or not in those days. So we figured if they could go out and get regular teachers' pay, 3, and then 2 of us could get started on the mission, which would be Unity House. But the order said, thank you, but no thank you. You can move out to an apartment, and you must stay in working in Catholic schools. So 2 of us were principals of schools, and one was a teacher at St. Rose, and 2 others taught in Catholic schools. So we said, okay, something is better than nothing. So we moved into 383 8th Street. That was the last house on the west bank of 8th Street. And we moved into a 3rd floor apartment, and that began one of the happiest times in my life. It really was very good. We had to live on our $2,500 a year after turning half of it into the mother house. We had to pay our rent, our food, everything. But you know, we lived like the poor. That was a good experience, you know, to see what living hand to mouth was like. We got very well known in the neighborhood, you know, even though we went out to school every day, weekends and nights. We visited, the people used to come to us. We tried to help out with things that we could. And it was just a very happy time. So it gave me the energy at the end of our first year there and beginning our second year to write to my superiors and say that I felt called to leave teaching school, even though I liked it, and I wasn't a bad teacher, I don't think. And you could ask some of my former students, though they might not say the same. I will be starting a mission, you know, so don't put me on the list for next year. I never got a reply to that, nor did I ask for one. I just did it. You know, it was a case of fools walk in where angels fear to tread, as I look back on it, because I didn't know anything really, except I had the will to get something going. So I told, Peter and I had become very good friends over that summer, and I told him about it. And he said, you know, I think I'd like to join you. The other sisters were very supportive. They helped in the planning, but they all had different things they were going to do the next year. One went over to work in Hospitality House in Albany to get a feel of the drug and alcohol culture there. Another one, 2 went away to grad school. So, but Peter said, I would love to do this, and I will see if I can wiggle my way through getting with you. He was out one night with the other friars, and they were at Lum's, which was a beer joint that no longer exists over here in Latham. And they got talking about what they were doing, and Regis, another one of the friars, said, I think I'm going into prison ministry. They were all going to be ordained the next year. And Peter said, well, why don't you think about coming with me? And he told them about our plans, forming something as yet unknown. And so Regis said, you know, that's not a bad idea. So they approached their boss, their provincial, to see if they, instead of going into a parish in the year before they were ordained priests, they could come and work at Unity House. And they got an okay too. So now we got 3 staff, no money, nothing. So I said, well, I heard about the Howard Bush Foundation, which still exists. And I thought it was Howard Bush Foundation, and I wrote a letter to Howard Bush Foundation, and we got $2,000 out of it, which we shouldn't have. That we weren't incorporated, we weren't hooked in with anybody, but we got the $2,000. So I didn't know it wasn't exactly what should be done. And then Father George O'Brien, who unfortunately died last year, was pastor of St. Mary's Church and ran the local Catholic Charities office. So I said we'd gotten to know George pretty well, how about some money? And he said, okay, write me a letter, da-da-da. So we got another $2,000. So we think, boy, we're rich. We got $4,000. And with 3 staff, it was pretty good. So I was still teaching, and I was telling my children, my class that year, that what we were going to do, but we needed a place in the poverty area, and we hadn't been able to find something. So this young woman Louise Leonard, who is now married to Pat McGrath, who was the county judge, said her father owned property on 8th Street and had been told, like everybody else, don't fix it up. There were 4 apartments, and 2 were vacated and 2 were occupied, and don't fix them up because we're going to be tearing them down. So we said, if you want to go in and clean out those apartments, they're full of garbage, and use them, you can do it. So we said, okay, and we got volunteers to help us shovel out junk when there was a lot of it, and that continued on for a good part of the next year. It never was a great place, nothing as fancy as this, for example, but we made it. Now, that first summer, the 2 gentlemen, Peter and Regis, had to complete their study, so they were gone for part of the summer, but we had other volunteers coming in and helping me. And our mission was just to get in there and see what we could do for the people living in the area. At that time, to my knowledge, there were no other services available outside of government, like there was the Department of Social Services, but there wasn't Joseph's House and Bethany Center and the Y, and as it is now, working with poor people. And we had understood from living a year on 8th Street how badly off the poor people were, how unjust the welfare system was and probably still is. I'm not up on my statistics like I used to be, but nobody could live on the amount of money that they receive from social services or Social Security or when they lost their job. Unfortunately, our ideal of wiping out poverty didn't quite come to fruition. The sad part of it is that poor people in so many ways today are worse off than they were then. While we've had many good things happen, not enough. And the problems are still wide, and you folks sure know it. And whether you work with the poor people in the street ministry or in domestic violence or with the children with disabilities or the mentally ill people or the people with AIDS, there still aren't enough services. But fortunately, you're here and you're doing it. There is some government money, but never enough to do everything. I guess I had to note here how hard it was for me to leave school, because I really liked teaching. It was a pleasure. But I just felt that I should be starting Unity House. And eventually it became, we always said, the greatest unplanned program in the history of Troy, because we had never planned to go out of this one little thing and we would do good things for people, quote unquote. So when we got together every day, we just figured out who's going to do what. You know, in the beginning we had 1 car, later we had 2 cars, but there were so many things to do. There was people who needed help and advocacy with welfare. There were people who needed medical care, and we had to find doctors, and we did find a few who would treat them free, and we had to get them there, and we had to get their medicines. Of course, food was always a great need. In fact, I think we had the first food pantry in the county, and unfortunately, it's probably still the largest. It's fortunate it is large, but the need for food is still there, and that's kind of sad. People began giving us clothing. So at this time, we're into just these 2 small apartments, and people are bringing clothes and food, and people are coming to see us. So we opened 6 days a week. We closed on Sunday. And then we were open 3 nights a week too. So we had neighborhood meetings at night, and we had programs for the teenagers at night, and we had volunteers doing that. During that first year too, we found out that the State Department of Transportation owned the building that is next to the parking lot on 8th Street. You know, it's 303 8th Street, a little brick building. And so I called up and I said, could we use that? Well, we're going to tear it down. And I said, well, how about until you tear it down? So they did let us use that, and that's where the teenagers had their programs at night. And then a group of women from the affluent neighborhood came in and said, we'd like to help. And one woman said that she had experience running a nursery school. So that became kind of the seeds of what would become a Sunshine Program. And we had a wonderful group of women, and they did a lot of good stuff for the kids, and they would get things. They could see some of the kids were not well fed and some were not well dressed, didn't have warm clothing, for example, and they took care of those needs. So that was very good. And a special angel came down from heaven that first year. I don't believe in angels in heaven, but anyway, this Carol Westby was her name, and she came to us, and she was just a marvelous person. Is there anyone here from the speech therapy department? Probably not, because they're all with the kids, Kevin, huh? Anyway, Carol Westby is a world-renowned figure now. She goes all over speaking. Her specialty was poor kids and minority communities. She came to us and worked for nothing for a year. In fact, even when we got a little bit of money later on, as we began to get into government business, everything she got, she put right back into the program. She brought equipment with it, and she was absolutely marvelous. And the reason why we were so happy to have her was one of the things we noticed from living on 8th Street was the high incidence of language problems with the children there. And looking into it, we found out for the whole city of Troy, there were only 2 therapists, which hardly, touched the need. And people with a little money could get special, take their children to speech therapists, pay for the therapy and so forth, but certainly not the poor people. So we were just delighted to have Carol. She did wonderful things. Then she got a job teaching over at SUNY, and she ran their speech therapy program. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but that language development, whatever, program there. And she brought her a number of students every day after school and worked with the kids. And the marvelous things resulted. And then we had a couple of summer camps that were just for those children. And then even some of the people from the affluent area heard about them, and could their kids come? We said sure. So that led to Sidney Johnson, a superintendent of schools, an Afro-American, by the way, who was a wonderful guy. Maybe some of you were in school when Sid was the superintendent. And he was very interested in what was going on at Unity House, and he became involved with some of the families and helped us out. And then he saw the need for the speech therapy throughout the district. So he asked Carol to plan a program that would work for Troy. She did, and now they have a couple of speech therapists, I believe, in every school in the city, so that kids are pretty well taken care of. Sid was not a dummy by any means, because Carol designed the program. Guess what? Cost nothing. Today you pay for consultants to do something like that, and they would make a good piece of money. But Carol was just an amazing person. And from here, the reason she was here, her husband was studying at RPI in a doctorate program. Then they moved to New Mexico, and she got involved with the Mexican children and did all kinds of things with them. And she continues all over the world, literally, doing things. And she's volunteered to, Chris ran into her last year at a conference that I had hoped to go to and didn't. And she offered to come here someday and run a program, so I hope that will happen soon. The other thing that happened were a group of school teachers took it on themselves to volunteer to come after school and do tutoring and working with the kids. And that was a very nice thing too. Sometimes they were, the kids were a hard group to handle, you know, because they'd been in school all day and then they came up, but we made it through. Among one of the volunteers, the earliest one was Mary Donahue, who was our lieutenant governor under Pataki. I didn't realize her name was Mary Donahue then. She had another name at the time she came to us, and I didn't realize till she was running for office and wrote me a letter and asked for support that she had been one of the early volunteers. She was Mary O'Connor, I think it was then. But anyway, we had some wonderful people all along the way who did a lot of good things. As we started out with the 4,000, as I told you, but as people saw we were there, some people said, hey, this is never going to last. This won't last 5 years. But guess what? This is 38th year. We fooled them. But people did see the good things were happening. Not everything was perfect, but a lot of good things did happen, and people began to donate money, which helped us get going. And then through board members and other folks, we began to take government money. And that was a hard decision, because once you take government money, as you probably know, because I think every program has government money in it, you have to abide by rules and regulations that they set forth for you, whether you like it or not. But on the other hand, certainly Unity House wouldn't be able to do the things it's doing if it weren't for government money. So that decision was a difficult one. It was nice in the early days to be able to figure things out and do things as you thought they ought to be done, but it didn't always work that way. It wouldn't have lasted that way, I should say. Now, the street ministry was the basis where we were doing all things for all men and women. Believe that, if you will. But out of that grew our other programs. I told you about the speech therapy, which became a separate program, and then the Sunshine School was separate, and then we merged them together. It made more sense. One of the earliest groups I became aware of there was a woman who had been badly beaten by her husband, and she came to us with her 3 small children. And she knew she couldn't go back home. She didn't dare go to any friends or relatives' house because she knew that her husband would find her and the beating, you know, would just begin again. So we figured out, well, what can we do? So we said, okay, you can stay here. Now, some of you, but not all of you, have been to 8th Street. You know the 2 apartments. We're talking about the first floor there, not very big, but we did have a couch and some chairs and a space heater, and we had a kitchen and a refrigerator with a stove and a refrigerator, and a bathroom we had put a shower into the bathroom. So the kids went to school by day, and then they hung around there and stayed there by night until we were able to get a place for them and through social services and get them set up. But that made us aware, and also the word got out that we were working with this family. So that was sort of the beginning of the domestic violence program that today is very big and growing, I guess, from what I hear. The same thing was true of mentally ill people. I'm sure you've all heard of deinstitutionalization. In the early 70s, the nation and the state included decided that mentally ill people didn't need to be kept in institutions. So that was true, but they put them out on the streets with nothing. You know, they might get welfare, I think, or maybe Social Security, but you couldn't make it on that. And especially if the early people had been in the institution for years and years and years. They didn't know how to cope with life outside the institution. You know, they didn't know how to cook or find an apartment or get the furniture or any of that. So that led us to look into, we had heard of one program in Albany. Father Mike Hogan had started Lancaster House as a part of Hospitality House. And so we went over there and looked at that, and we found out you could get 75%, I believe it was, of the cost of your program. You had to come up with the other 25%, which wasn't easy. That was the part I hated most, and the part that helped me make up my retirement when I did, that was raising money. I hate it. Some people are very good at it. I'm not, and I minded it very much. But if we wanted to keep going, we had to do it. So we started fundraisers, like there was an annual cocktail party for many years. And now that continues with the, it's been the Autumn Fest the last few years. I retired in '91 after, I taught school for 22 years, and then I decided after 20 years at Unity House, my job had changed a lot, and I decided it was time to retire and do some other stuff. Because I started out, you know, among the folks, working with the folks, but as you get government money and contracts and da-da-da and da-da-da, the whole job changed. And I could see that my future would be trying to go out and get money, and I didn't want to do that. So anyway, there are people who don't mind. Chris is very good at it, and you've had different people in that office working on fundraising, and they're doing a fine job, and it's very necessary. My husband and I decided, I think it might have been about 10 years ago, but I'm not sure, that there were many unmet needs among the poor people, even when they did have Social Security and public assistance and all that stuff. So we started the Deuteronomy Fund, and that continues today. Many people contribute to it, and I'm sure you all heard of it. The sad thing is the need continues and grows too. We named it the Deuteronomy Fund, only I don't know much about the book of Deuteronomy. I was never a Bible scholar, but I found a quote in there that you should give of what you have to the poor of the land. And so that is the basis of that fund, and that continues. We were given the 2 apartments on the north to begin with, shoveling out, and people lived on the other side. But as they moved out, the owner let us use those 2, and then eventually when the word came through that this highway wasn't going to be built along this side because of the danger of mudslides, they, he said, well, you can have the building if you want it. So we got it for back taxes, but we had to go to one of these public hearings where you bid on buildings. And I was, fortunately, Ed Spain, who is now a judge, was with me. And some woman was there that I'd never seen before in her sense, and she started bidding against me. I was just about dead, but I think at about 7,000 she quit. And so it was a pretty good bargain. And then the other building I was talking about was south of that. There were buildings right adjacent to it where the parking lot is now, and some wonderful volunteers at Unity House lived in that. They went to RPI, and then they volunteered with us. And one of them, Tom Cooper, the year after he graduated in 1972, came to work. And he was paid $50 a week whether he needed it or not too. And then he worked for us with for a couple of years. Then he went to run Big Brothers Big Sisters for a couple of years, and then he came back and we gave him $100 a week. And I said, Tom, I bet you're the only person who graduated from RPI that doubled his salary in 4 or 5 years. This is an ad in the paper. Wanted any inner city worker with good interpersonal skills, flexibility, generosity to work 6 days and 3 evenings a week. Must be available 24 hours a day, must live in the neighborhood. Salary $60 a week. We'd gone up. Anyway, so Peter and Regis and I stayed very, very tight, and they both left the priesthood. I left the convent in 1974. I guess I left that out. You probably wondered when you heard I had a husband. I left the convent in 74. I married in 1980, and unfortunately my husband died 5 years ago. He was a great guy. What's the young woman that just spoke to me? Corbett, is that your name? Works in DV, and she asked me if I ever heard of the Catholic Worker, and yes, I have. They're a wonderful organization. Dorothy, well, they wouldn't even like the word organization, but Dorothy Day founded it in New York City. A wonderful woman. She had quite a past. I won't go into it, but you might want to look up. She's got a lot of books that she's written and have written about her. And this is what she looked like. I had the honor of meeting her a couple of different Sundays back in probably '69, somewhere in there. The Catholic Worker from New York City used to have a summer place in Tivoli, New York, about an hour from here. And every Sunday they used to have discussion groups. So a friend of mine invited some of us to go down and sit around and listen to her talk. And then another time she came up to the Dominican Retreat House and spoke. But she was exceptional in her care for the poor. And there are many, many Catholic worker homes. And Corbett worked in Portland, Oregon, did you? I have visited the one in LA, and my sister is a volunteer in one in, oh dear, what's the city? I forget the city outside of LA, but where they go down at night and pass out supper and warm blankets to the poor along there. We have a wonderful group over in Albany, Trinity Place. They do wonderful things too. So we had, when we first started the first domestic violence shelter, we called it the Dorothy Day House, and it was called that for many years. Not because we lived as simply as Dorothy Day did and not take government money, but because I admired her so much. But somehow that name got lost along the way. So this was stuck in a closet in Chris's office, and so I said, well, why don't you give me that, and I'd like to bring it, which I will, down to the Catholic worker people in Albany and give it to them. Let's see. All right, now I guess we're open for questions, huh?
The $2,000 that we accepted from Catholic Charities right at the very beginning, did that come with any strings?
We didn't know it at the time. Well, the answer is yes and no, because it was a very loose organization, and I think they didn't know what to do with it, you know, and I didn't realize for about 6 months that we were part of Catholic Charities, but it worked out well because they would ultimately take care of, grants had to come in through a certified organization, so our grants could come in through them. They used to give us some money too, not a whole lot, but and we had general meetings, but I was treated like any other director, but we did our own thing. We had our own board, and we did our thing over here in Troy, and they never interfered. Oh, the only time they interfered was, what year did McGovern run? 1972? Yeah, 72. I did not realize that nonprofits do not take political stands. They're not supposed to. That doesn't mean they don't. But anyway, I had, in the front window at 8th Street, I had a huge poster of McGovern. So somebody reported me to the head of Catholic Charities at the time, who was Father Richard Downs, and he came over to see me and he said, "Sister, don't you know that da-da-da and da-da-da?" I said, "No, I didn't, Father. We'll take it down immediately." I found out later he was Democrats supporting Nixon. So anyway, we stayed in Catholic Charities, and things went, very well. We had some, good things that came out of that. But then all of a sudden, they decided that, and Catholic Charities covered the whole diocese, which is, I think, 14 counties. So they decided that they would take so much out of every contract, for their support, because they were running us. So our board decided thank you, but no thank you. So this happened just about before I left, didn't it? We decided to get a divorce and incorporate it on our own, and we did. And they were pretty gentle about it. So we're now a separately incorporated nonprofit, 501c3. Yes, ma'am.
Where did the inspiration for the name come from?
Oh, that's a good question. A lot of wine. It was really funny. There were 5 of us sisters who lived in an apartment on 8th Street, and so Peter and Regis came down one night. We were, talking about what we're going to do, and then somebody threw, well, what are you going to call ourselves? So we just, continued to drink wine and chat things around. Then finally, so I don't even know which one of us came up with Unity House. Well, that fits good. We like that. So we did.
When we started at 309 8th Street, did we stay there throughout your entire tenure?
No. That leaves I left out a good part, and I never thought about it. We were all co-directors. See, Peter, Regis, and I. Nobody was in charge, except I signed the checks. But no, the reason for that was that it was very clear from their order they could only stay for 1 year. They would be ordained priests the end of that first year in June of 72, and they would have to leave, and they did for other. Regis was assigned to teach school out in the western part of the state, and Peter went to Hoboken, New Jersey. So we were all co-directors, and then other people came in. Greg Menard, who was a good friend of Chris's, and had just gotten out of college, came over, and Tom Cooper later on. We began to hire people. Well, we were still trying to do this while we're all in charge. But by this time we had a board, and they called me in and they said, that's got to stop. You're getting big, you're getting government money, somebody's got to be in charge, somebody's got to take the responsibility of the organization. I said, okay, agree, but it won't be me. I want to continue working here, but I don't want to be in charge. So they met again, and they brought me in. They said, well, you have 2 choices. You either stay and be director, or you go. Okay, this is about year 5, 4 or 5. So I did, and we did stay there for a little bit, but then by this time we had gotten the Sunshine School was going, and everything was started by 1980. See, so things came along rather quickly, and we were getting government contracts and money and so forth. So a few of us moved down to where Bethany Center is now at 17 State Street, in the back end of the United Urban Ministry at the time, the front part, and we had the back part. Then, I can't remember why, but we had to move again, and we moved to First Street. I think it was 21 First, right across from the YWCA, where we had offices that were owned by a law firm, and we had $75 a month rent, which was pretty good. But then they decided they needed the office space, so we went back up to 8th Street. And that was kind of nice, back among the folks that I knew. And one day this woman who had 14 children, we had been involved in a lot, had moved away, and she came back, and she came in and she says to the first person she met in the front room, I'd like to see Sister Mary Jane. And the woman said, have you got an appointment? And she said, listen, ma'am, I knew Mary Jane when you didn't need an appointment to see her. I love that. That was Gladys Gibson, if anyone knew the Gibson family. She was unique. Anyway, I was very happy there, but then again we were outgrowing our space, so I knew St. Joseph's School in South Troy had closed, and so I went to the board and said, how about if we look at that? We did, and we bought that building, and I think we moved in there about 86, 87, something like that. Something like
yes.
that. Anyway, and then the Sunshine, and that had been a traveling camp, believe me. They had been all over the city, different sites. So they moved in on the first floor, and the offices, the administration went to the top floor. And I got very down after that, and I didn't know why. And my husband said, I'll tell you why. And he said, because you liked it up on 8th Street where you could see the folks, you know, even though I was, my time was spent on, you know, other stuff, but I would see the people and, you know, talk with them and blah, blah, blah. And now he's down in South Troy. Don't tell Kevin I said it like this, but, you know, huh?
He's back.
Oh, anyway, so then I retired, and not because of that. I retired in '91 from there. Okay, what else you got?
Well, I think everybody heard you say that whenever we started a new program, it was because there were people coming to us at the
Right.
street ministry program who needed help and nobody was doing anything. Were there programs that we had to let go of, and any that you would particularly remember that you were very sad about?
Well, the club, but that happened after I left. Yeah, I remember like parts of things. I remember we had a program where we had a couple of staff going into the public schools where our kids were located, poor kids were located, and finding out who wasn't showing up for school and why, you know. So a lot of good things happened with that. And but we lost the funding on that, and that had to go. Yeah, we used to do what Tom does now, collect furniture and bring it to people. Yeah, we had a grant, we got the truck, and we had some funding for the drivers, and a lot of good stuff was done, but we lost funding on that. What else?
Summer speech camp?
Yeah, well, that was blended in to become the summer camp that goes on. Yeah, that was just in the beginning, as I think I had mentioned that it was just for children with speech and language disabilities, but now it's covers a lot of kids.
How about the Jesuit volunteers?
Oh yeah, and we haven't got any left, have we? For about 10 years, we had young people come to work with us. They were called Jesuit Volunteers, and the name came from the fact it was sponsored by the Jesuit order, but they weren't necessarily Catholics, but most of them came from Jesuit colleges. And they pledged a year of working in poverty programs all over the country. And ours came what used to be known as the Northeast section. Now they're all one. But we were able to start a lot of programs because of Jesuit Volunteers. All we had to do was provide a place for them to live, give an allowance for food, and then would they get $25 a month, whether they needed it or not? We did a lot of it whether you needed it or not stuff. Of course, you might still be saying that today too, because. But anyway, I remember we started the supported apartment programs with 2 Jesuit volunteers. You know, because people had been in our original residence and were ready to go out on their own, but they needed some support and help. So they did that. We enlarged the domestic violence program quite a bit during that time too by Jesuit volunteers who were able to do other things. In the beginning of the domestic violence program, we had 2 staff and everything else was done by volunteers. But you couldn't have sustained that program for very long that way. My husband and I did overnight work, you know, and many other people did too. In fact, everyone that was there at night was a volunteer with a little training and a lot of love and care in their hearts. A lot of good things happened.
When I applied here, I was out of a job. I was looking for a job in human services. I had 5.5 years experience in that field. I really wanted to move to Boston. My heart was still in New England. I wanted to move back to New England. I looked over there for jobs, and I could have found a job over there, but the pay over there was worse than it is in this area, believe it or not. Of course, the standard of living was much higher, and I was married at the time with a 1-year-old daughter, and it just wasn't going to work. So when I saw this job in the paper, I said, this is for me. And I had never met Mary Jane, but I came for my first interview, and I really liked her and liked everything I heard and really wanted the job. And I got called back for a second interview, and I was really excited. I said, this must mean that they really like me and they're interested. And then I got called back for a third interview with the board member president, and I said, this is a sure thing. And then I got the call from Mary Jane that, you know, we really, really liked you, but you were our second choice. We chose somebody else. So I was devastated, and I literally had tears in my eyes.
But you were
Tearing up
very-
now even thinking about it.
But you were very nice, and you thanked me and for the opportunity and thought I had a great organization.
So I went for my second choice, which was selling frozen foods. Hey, you know, you got a little kid, you got to make money. So I went away for a training program in Connecticut, and while I was there, it was a 2-week training program. I think during the first week I got a call. Please come back, we have another job we would like to you to consider. So I came back and I said, now it's a sure thing, because they wouldn't call me and tell me. They put me through 3 more interviews, the same process. And I got that job, but I swear to God, I was never sure about that.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you.
And a picture
Oh,
of
isn't that, oh,
309
309 A Street,
Yeah.
isn't that, oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, roses. Oh, lovely, thank you. Thank you. Keep on keeping on.
When Mary Jane started Unity House, as she said, it was a $4,000 organization. 10 years later, it was the agency's budget was $1.2 million, and by the time she left 10 years after that, it was a $4.8 million organization. So we had already grown dramatically, and as she said, never in a planned way. And when I came to Unity House in 1981, I was quickly infused with the spirit that she generated and the belief that we needed to find a way to respond when people were in need and nobody was helping. But the job she had me in was program administrator was the title, and I was supervising the directors of all of our different programs. And so when Mary Jane or any of us would encounter a need, and then she would find some way to get funding to meet that need, oftentimes the programs would say, this is all happening too fast, we can't keep up with it, we don't have enough staff. Yet, by the, you know, within the, as you can tell, going from 1.2 million to 4.8 million, growing by, what is that? That's 4 times, right? I mean, growing 4-fold in 10 years, that was from the date I started till the date she left. I obviously was very unsuccessful in, you know, convincing her to slow down. You know, as you can tell from listening to Mary Jane, the passion that she has for our work was imbued within the entire organization, and it was like, you know, it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. Now, I had to learn a lot of things. One of the reasons that she left was, as she stated, she wasn't going to do fundraising. She wasn't going to ask people for money, and she knew that we had to do that. So, you know, before she left, she told me the first thing you've got to do is you've got to learn about fundraising. You've got to go away. I'm going to send you to a training. You're going to learn about fundraising, and you're going to come back, and you're going to start, you know, doing what you should do. And she did. I went away for a week, and my first training on how to raise money, and it probably took me a good 12 or 13 years to actually learn to do it and to do it right. Because I fought it too. I mean, you know, I don't know amongst all of you who would you like to do that, but it's a hard thing to do, especially you know if you grew up without much money, and you know you've never done it before. How do you turn to somebody and say, you know, please give of your treasure to help our cause? But once I started doing it, it got easier and easier and easier. And why? Because it became readily apparent that there were a lot of people out there who wanted to make a difference in the world. They had money. They knew that they couldn't do it directly by working with people directly, but they knew that they could help. if they were to give them the money that they had. And, you know, philanthropy, there were a lot of people out there who really wanted to make a difference, but they wanted to do it in a way with an organization they could trust and that they knew was doing good work. And I started to find out pretty readily that when I talked to people, I mean, they said yes far more often than they said no. Because I was really making a match. You know, I was making a match between people who wanted to change the world and us who could change the world, you know, one person at a time. So that got easier and easier. But, you know, it was a rough transition in those early years. You know, our growth has had a steady pattern. You know, we've gone from, as I said, 4,000 to 1.2 million to 4.8 million. To 11.2 million 10 years after that, to now we're close to 18 million. We're growing at a rate that's far faster than the cost of living increases that the rise in the consumer price index, and that's been happening for forever. It's just, like I said, it's momentum. It's who we are. When Carla and I became co-leaders of the organization, which was in what year do you think?
2002, I'm thinking. Would that sound right?
2002, I think. 2002, 2003 at the absolute latest. Then all that changed. It didn't happen immediately, but it started to change because we both needed to be concerned about both. And all of a sudden, I could start to see some of the things that she was saying, and she could start to see some of the things that I was saying much more clearly. And I think since then, we have continued to steadily grow, but we have also built an infrastructure that is necessary to do things right. We paid a lot more attention than we used to checking on how are we doing quality-wise. We've done things like gotten accreditation in our Unity Sunshine daycare programs. We've done a lot more with surveys of the people, our consumers, to make sure that what we're doing is what they need and want. You know, so a lot has changed in just recent years in that regard. And I think it's for the good of the organization.
And I think something that's really unique and noteworthy about Chris is, as he mentioned, we now have gone back to a shared leadership model. Chris and I essentially are co-directors of the organization. That happened as a result of Chris's initiative and wanting that to happen. It was a result of his decision in some ways to share the power of responsibility for the organization. So I think, first of all, it's a really interesting thing that we've kind of gone back to what was an original sort of structure. And I think that it's something that is truly remarkable and just astonishing that Chris did this, that he sort of created this opportunity for this to happen. It was not easy, as any of you, might have guessed who've ever been around leadership, and the development of organizational generally. But I mean, has evolved, I think, into a structure that, just feels like absolutely the right structure for Chris and I here at Unity House. But I just sort of, in case you weren't aware of that, I mean, that is how we operate now. And it was really, he came out of the blue with that sort of suggestion, and was the one who created the structure and made it work. So it's really quite a remarkable, I think, like to pay tribute to him and his willingness to sort of be creative and do that. And then, what it's meant in terms of, I think, the ability to lead the organization. As he said, it's kind of forced us both to consistently look from sort of both perspectives.
I wanted to reminisce a little bit, and that's probably not the right word, but talk about some of the programs that we used to have that we no longer have, talk a little bit about why they're no longer with us, and the first one I have on the list is the Fifth Avenue Social Club, Valerie mentioned. This was probably the hardest thing we ever had to do. It was certainly the hardest thing I ever had to do. And it wasn't something that, it was really something that was forced upon us by the times. And the year that Valerie, do you remember the year? Carla, do you remember the year? It wasn't that long ago.
2000?
About 2000. And what had been happening in the field of mental health support was that there had been a growing effort, both from individuals and from government, to see more peer-run organizations. And some localities had programs that started up. So in Rensselaer County, a program called COAST had started up and was attracting enough people to come to them that the government in Rensselaer County felt that this was the wave of the future. And that state government was pushing them to give more and more funds to consumer-run programs and less funds to programs that were operated by agencies like ours. And the writing became pretty clear that it was something that we either had to do on our own, or we were going to be, you know, it was going to be, the money was just going to be taken away from us. Now, Bridge Coalition is a little different story, we were given the grant for a 5-year period, which is remarkable. Foundations almost never give you grants for more than 1 year, sometimes 2, but 5 years is unheard of. But because we knew that this wasn't going to happen overnight, we needed time to make this happen. So when we started the project, we started true to our vision and tried to work with the adults. But over time, the program really morphed into a program that was working mostly with the children. And we kind of lost a little sight of what we were originally trying to do, in part because it wasn't working very well. You know, we really weren't able to engage the adults the way we had hoped to. We did not have them start to, you know, kind of take control of their own destiny. And in part, over time, we started to feel like we were getting in the way, that having people on that block who were working with their kids, giving them a place to come after school, initiating anti-drug drives, you know, and walks and things like that, we were getting in their way. So towards the end, we had the program, I think, for about 2 years. We made a last-ditch effort to really try to get the neighbors involved and the adults in the neighborhood involved, and I think we made some good steps in that direction, and because they knew we were getting out of the way, you know. So that's more of an example of a program that was meant from the very beginning to end. It was never meant to be a program that went on forever. The hard part about that one was we had done such good work with these kids, it was really hard to let it go. But the Howard and Bush Foundation didn't give us the money for that purpose, and they were willing to continue it for a while longer, but not for that purpose. That isn't why they gave it to us. We did make some attempts to try to get some funding for after-school programs and that kind of thing, but it just never, we were never able to find that funding, and that program eventually had to go. The Safety Zone, interesting program that, see Danielle nodding her head. Safety Zone was a program that was set up specifically to serve gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender youth, or people who were, kids who were questioning. It was funded by a grant from the state, and in the beginning, in the early years of the Safety Zone, the numbers were higher than they became as time went on, but over time, the number of kids who were using the Safety Zone came down to about 4 or 5 on a regular basis. And the state was giving us $60,000 a year, and the state said, we can't keep giving you $60,000 a year when it's only helping 4 kids. So we had to let that program go because the funding went away. But interestingly enough, we kind of keep making small efforts to start it back up in small ways. And, you know, I think we're continually looking for ways to do it, at least on a small scale. Interestingly enough, when we started that program, talking about fundraising, it was a little bit of a blow to our fundraising efforts in some ways. In other ways, it did the opposite. But I got 2 letters. Remember that we were part of Catholic Charities before, so we had a lot of people who were who had known us because of their association with the Catholic Church. We had 2 letters from 2 very good-sized donors who were giving us quite a bit of money every year that said, you know, that's the last year you're ever going to get money from us. How could you do that? You know, how could you serve kids that are gay? And I mean, it was just awful. So, you know, hey, let everybody have their own thing, but that was a little bit of a trying thing to have to go through. We had a daycare center in Albany. I know people in Sunshine know about that. I'm sure you all do. It was our first venture into having a site physically located in a county other than Rensselaer County. There was a great need, and still is, for affordable daycare in Albany County. A number of daycares had closed. We found a site, started a program. The biggest problem with what we tried to do was that the site was completely inadequate. Pregnancy prevention program that we had in our very early years. Prevention was one of the very first things that our founders thought they could do. There was, in the neighborhood, as they got to know kids, there were a bunch of 15, 16, 17-year-olds that were constantly with child, and they made a determination they were going to end teenage pregnancy in the neighborhood within the first year. And she likes to tell the story, I wish she could be here to tell it, that they were 0% successful. So at that point we gave up because we were completely helpless, despite our best efforts. Also in 1997, we started we had our first crisis bed. Prior to that, we had started a hospital diversion program in one of our residences, which is a similar thing, but without funding. And then we got a little bit of funding to have our first crisis bed, and only one. The case management program started with reinvestment money in 1996. And this is a big one. In 1996, the residences went smoke-free. Oh, well. We have tried so hard as we've grown as we're trying to build this infrastructure where we have the right amount of administrative support. We have a really well-functioning finance department. We've got a human resources department that's grown as we've grown to provide an array of services for people. We've got more support in most of our programs, so there's more supervisors available to provide support for staff. But what I really miss the grassroots. I think we try really hard to stay grassroots, true to our origins. But as you get bigger and bigger, it gets harder and harder. So I used to know, when I started here, I used to know every staff person by name. I got to know most of them pretty well. Now, probably about a third of this room, I don't know your name at all. And that I really, really miss. And I wish that there was a way that I could do what I need to do my job right, because I've got to be out there doing external work, raising money, meeting with government officials, influencing them to change legislation, et cetera, and still know every staff person. I think that's what I miss the most. Anybody else? Okay, take a break. Thank you.